Hello everyone, welcome back to our second to last pre-recorded lecture in this series. I can't believe it. This is Anna DeWitt, your instructor as always, and today we are working on chapters 21 and 22 in Preble's art forms. So basically we're going from the late 18th century to the early 20th century. As a bit of an introduction to the late 18th and 19th centuries, which is what chapter 21 is on. So we're starting to find ourselves in a modern age, launched by industrial, American, and French revolutions. It's considered another enlightenment, not like the Renaissance itself, but definitely an enlightenment, considered the age of reason, where people had rational and scientific approaches to belief systems. And also, there was a lot of stylistic pluralism. That means that the styles kind of muddled together and overlapped. It wasn't like a very clear, first there's Baroque and then there's Rococo, but instead everything starts to kind of like overlap and pick and take pieces from each other and mix together. And also, the traditional sources of patronage gradually withered. So the way that artists ended up being paid for their work became more like what it is now, where you seek gallery representation. To kick things off, we are going to start with Neoclassicism, which is an emulation of classical Greek and Roman art. So these themes keep coming back over and over again. And it's also an effort to represent non-hereditary government, such as the Republic. So we're starting to lean away from kings and queens and more into not necessarily democracy, but in a lot of cases, democracy, which is pretty exciting. For example, here we have The Oath of Horace by David, and this is a story of virtue and readiness to die for liberty. So Horace here is standing up for what he believes in, but also not so much about the story behind this, just looking at the figures themselves. They have a very sculptural quality in the lights and shadows of their muscles and their clothes. And also, the women over here are completely overcome. They're unable to participate in what's going on. They're like practically passed out. And this really reflects the belief of the time that women were unfit for public life. And this leads into another point, which is that women were banned from art academy classes in which unclothed models were used. This is a major point because the nude was like the have-all, end-all of what fine art was at the time, and women didn't have access to that. But moving forward, here's an example of a woman artist portraying women in a very different, more positive light. This is by Angelica Kaufman, who overcame many obstacles of women's exclusion from professional art. And this piece, called Design, shows a very different vision of women's abilities in comparison to The Oath of Horace. I wanted to put in here that curious Googlers might want to note Linda Nochlein's Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? I'm not going to test you on it, but it is related to this. One of the many reasons that women were denied access, or one of the many reasons why women artists haven't excelled in the same way as men, is that they were denied access to nude figure drawing classes, therefore missing out on the most popular subject matter of fine art for many years. But maybe that's just my feminist agenda. If any of you baby feminists out there want a really amazing art historiographer to look at about how the history of art was written and why it was written that way, definitely check out Linda Nochlin. All right, moving on from that, let's talk about Romanticism. This was actually in reaction to Neoclassicism, and it agrees with the neoclassic importance of individual liberty, but takes a different approach to it with more focus on emotional expression. Imagination and emotion is seen as more valuable than reason in Romanticism. And also there's a lot of focus on nature and how nature is less corrupt than civilization. And also there's a bit of a preoccupation with current events, so starting to have a little bit of a journalistic making art about what's happening in the world around you type of theme. So, for example, here we have The Burning of the Houses of Lords and Commons by J.M.W. Turner. And this specific scene captures a disastrous fire in Parliament from only months before the painting was made. And it has the most loose and expressive brushwork that we've seen in art history up to this date. And also introduced the idea of distorting and exaggerating the truth of what you see in front of you. The flames did not actually go as high as depicted in this painting. Also, the river was actually straightened here to achieve a more wide horizon, so this isn't actually what the scene looked like, but it is more of what the artist envisioned, and it's acceptable. It's like we can kind of suspend our disbelief for the inclusion of an artist's creative vision. There's really more of an emphasis on the feeling it gives you rather than the actual geography of the place. Now, still thinking about how during Romanticism people were very preoccupied with current events in their art, we come to Francisco Goya, who made this piece, the 3rd of May, 1808, and this was made because Goya himself experienced the horrors of Napoleon's occupation. And under Napoleon's occupation, there were all of these firing squad executions, and that's what's being depicted here. There's a firing squad executing suspects, even though there's not necessarily a full amount of evidence to prove that they should be executed. And you can see there's this sort of mechanical uniformity of the faceless firing squad. The only real faces that you see are the faces of the victims. So it really makes the firing squad seem kind of cold and heartless and more like just an authoritarian group of people all working as one unit and not really having any individual thoughts or care for others. Whereas that's contrasted with the ragged and emotional expressions of the targets that are, probably seeing their life flash before their eyes this very moment. And this piece is not only a protest of Napoleon's occupation in particular, but also of just tyrannical governments as a whole. Next, we are still in the idea of Romanticism, but moving away from current events and more towards the romantic nature of, nature, talking about American landscape painting. The first example we have here is the Oxbow by Thomas Cole. It has this very broad panoramic view, and this was actually painted in the style of the Hudson River School of Art. And this style can be characterized by a broad panoramic view, like I just said, but also carefully rendered details and a very light-filled atmosphere. So you can see the huge contrast between the light, sunny, cloudy area of the sort of great plain over the river, and then this dark rain cloud in the corner. Now, here is a bit of food for thought, though. How does American landscape painting, by painters of European descent during this time in history, promote the idea of manifest destiny? Could it be romanticizing our colonization of this land as we push natives further and further west? I just think it's important to kind of think about how, even if something is beautiful, it could be used as a tool or a form of, in this case, I'd say a lot of American landscape painting, whether it was intentional or not, was definitely used as a form of propaganda to promote this whole idea of Americans pushing further and further west. And I think we all know that that wasn't a nice or good thing to do, so just something to consider. However, on the other hand, there are plenty of American landscape painters that weren't white people and were just, showing the beauty of the world. For example, Robert S. Duncanson, who was an African-American painter with an international reputation. And this is the painting Blue Hole, Little Miami River by Duncanson, in which he modified the very precise realism of the Hudson River School style of art, and instead used a sort of original poetic softening of the space and orchestrated light, color, and detail. Now, getting into France's Romantic paintings, this is The Death of Sardanapalus, which was based on a play by Lord Byron. and in which the title character takes poison and orders his favorite possessions to be destroyed before him, and then the viewers all have their emotional response to this horrifying event. And that subject matter aside, let's just get into the formal composition, because there's a very diagonal composition here from the top right to from the top left to the bottom right. And also using chiaroscuro, which really recalls themes from the Baroque. Also, this is done very painterly, in a painterly style. And if you don't know what I mean when I say that, saying something that is painterly means that it's kind of in a loose, open style in which the qualities of the paint, like the fact that it's made out of brush strokes, are apparent, and it's not all like blended to perfection, but it's a bit more loose, basically. Now we come to a major shift in pretty much everything, because the invention of photography changed art forever. So here is about the moment where photography was invented. And we've already talked about photography to a great extent in a previous lecture, but it's important to note, like, when in our narrative that we're going through today, that photography came along, because cameras really freed painters from the role of narrator or illustrator. There's not really the complete need for, like, if you wanted to remember what someone looked like, you don't have to hire a portrait artist to paint their portrait perfectly. You can just take a photo. And so this idea that everything had to be a perfect reflection of nature or what's in front of them kind of fizzled away from here on out. The early photography technology was very cumbersome and also toxic in its early phases. We've talked about this before in the photography lecture, but just certain processes required being exposed to dangerous chemicals, which presented practical challenges, especially in the barren regions of the Western wilderness, trying to lug around all of this camera equipment, which is what we're seeing here. So this is Iceberg Canyon by Timothy O'Sullivan, and it is a stark, austere, and well-crafted photograph in which the sitter is very perfectly positioned on the rocks. So we're not really moving towards full abstraction just yet, right after the camera was invented, but we are inching our way. So where we're starting is realism. But you'll see the farther we go, the farther away from realism we get. But what is realism? It's a style depicting the ordinary without idealism, exoticism, or nostalgia. It's a reaction to both Neoclassicism and Romanticism. And instead of an artist taking a scene and putting their own spin on it, it's quite literally just like an artist saying, hey, look at this. So right here we have Courbet. Gustave Courbet's The Stonebreakers. This depicts ordinary road workers. There's no real dramatization of the struggle. It's just a depiction of the day-to-day life and basically just the mundane. There were many accusations made towards Courbet, saying that he was raising a cult of ugliness, or that his work was inartistic or even socialistic. And also, this led him to not be able to exhibit the way that other artists were exhibiting, but have to set up his own exhibitions. This is also an example of a plein air painting, which is when you paint outdoors. In this case, it's an oil painting outdoors. But plein air just means that you're like out in the space painting what you see in front of you that day. Instead of like taking a photograph and some sketches and coming home and working on it, it's like you bring your easel and you're there in front of the waterfall and you're painting the waterfall and you're right there. Not necessarily a waterfall, but that's just an example. So this was first done by Courbet, and it was made possible because of the invention of portable paint tubes, which people didn't have before. And this really helped artists have the ability to capture their first impressions of a space instead of getting so caught up in their head thinking about it and all of the studies that they would have to do to then go home and paint it later. It really kind of opened up a more loose and free way of working. Now, still in realism, let's talk a bit about academic art. Academic art is tradition-minded works that follow formulas laid down by an academy or a school. So different schools would have different ways of teaching people to paint. For example, the French Academy, and one thing that the French Academy was especially known for was their salon, or their salons, because there were multiple of them. But the salon was an annual exhibition in the 19th century, and it was the only way an artist might become known in those days. Like, if you wanted to be a famous artist, you had to have your work in the salon. And that meant that you had to have your work approved by a certain set of people. And if your work wasn't approved, then you were just kind of like put on mute and no one would get to know that you exist. Although some people did revolt against this and create the Salon des Refusés, in which they just showed their own work despite the fact that they couldn't. But that is getting a little bit off topic. Here we have Rosa Bonheur's The Horse Fair, which is definitely an example of an academic artwork that would have been accepted by the French Academy's Salon. In fact, I think it was selected by the Salon, or for the Salon. But this artist specialized in rural scenes with animals and had surging imagery in their works, and there is a possible self-portrait near the center, although we're not sure. As another example of an academic painting, we have Jean-Léon Gérôme, who was the teacher of Thomas Eakins, and this painting by Gérôme is Pygmalion and Galatea, which is based on a story from mythology, but executed with academic and controlled fashion. So if you don't know the story of Pygmalion, it's basically a sculptor is trying to sculpt a perfect female form and ends up falling in love with his sculpture. But then, like I said, how Gérôme was the teacher of Thomas Eakins, we can see now, looking at Thomas Eakins, his influence from Gérôme. This is William Rush carving his allegorical figure, which is also a story from mythology executed with an academic controlled fashion, but it's a bit different. It contrasts Pygmalion with a more realist view. Instead of being quite so romantic, it's more, the studio is messy and imperfect that this artist is working in. The models are actually, were considered not perfect of the time. Painting people the way they actually looked completely shocked the public. And the model, especially the nude model here, was thought to have a lumpy body compared to beauty standards, and people just thought it was crazy that he didn't smooth out those lumps, and he actually showed them. Next, we have Henry Ossawa Tanner. This is his piece, The Banjo Lesson, and this is actually a work from the best-known African-American painter before the 20th century, and I just wanted to show that it was not all white people that were making these advances in the arts. So Tanner, specifically, studied with Eakins, who we just looked at, in Philadelphia, and created many dignified portrayals of Black home life, and still focusing on the sort of mundane day-to-day life of realism that we're talking about, but in a more academic style of painting. And he avoids sentimentality, but does exhibit humanistic content. And then next, we have Edouard Manet, who was a sort of predecessor of Impressionism, which is what we're about to get into next, who combined the sort of flattened painting of the Japanese style with Courbet's realism. So you'll start to see from here on out, everyone is incredibly influenced by the sort of flat style of Japanese prints. And you might look at this and be like, that doesn't look flat to me. That's like got nice shading or whatever. But this was way more like flattened out than what people had been doing previously. Before, it was like you had to have the like perfect in-depth shading of every single muscle. And this is a little bit more stylized than people were used to. So there is an interest in visual issues over content here. This piece in particular is called Luncheon on the Grass, and it shows a female nude with clothed males, and there's no allegorical context to this. It's not like a story from mythology or from literature. There's nothing really explaining why this lady is naked and her friend is back there, and then there are just some fully clothed guys all having a picnic. And this very much shocked viewers and critics because her nudity is put in contrast with the men's clothes, and honestly, it just seemed like a good excuse to slut-shame this woman and therefore see the whole piece as completely obscene. Now moving on to Impressionism, which is a very beautiful style of painting in which we start moving farther and farther away from trying to be picture perfect to reality. The Impressionists were a group formed after their denial to the 1873 Salon and organized their own independent exhibition. They created what they called impressions of what the eye actually sees rather than what the mind interprets. So, for example, here, probably the most famous Impressionist is Claude Monet. And right now we are looking at his piece, Saint Lazare Station, which focuses on the play of light amid steam of locomotive. Now, the term Impressionism actually arose from Monet's different series of paintings called Impression Sunrise. He had different versions of this. Now, this is the main Impression Sunrise that we're looking at right now. The term Impressionist was initially meant to be derogatory, but the artists found that it was a pretty fitting description and they embraced it. And this style consists of small dabs of color that appear as separate strokes up close, but seem blended together when looking from far away. And because of this, they were able to use more pure, vibrant colors than they would have to if they were actually blending all of these strokes together, because the optical blending that you get from stepping farther away does that for you. So we start to see more excitingly vivid colors. Also, they were definitely optimistic about new technology, specifically about photography and how that would free them from the previous norms of painting. Another Impressionist to know is Renoir. This is Le Moulin de la Galette, which is a sort of massive crowd shot of a bunch of contemporary middle-class people enjoying outdoor leisure activities. And this sort of interest in human drama is balanced by interest in very visual qualities, such as the light filtering through the trees. So you can really see these speckles of light hitting everyone in these different ways. And it does kind of balance just having something technically beautiful to work with, but also challenging to work with, and then also having all of these fun little opportunities to create scenes of people interacting with each other. Next, we have Edgar Degas, who approached this a bit differently than Impressionists did, but I'd still consider him an Impressionist. He has these sort of spontaneous-looking compositions that actually posed more like street photography in the sense that things felt more like action shots. This piece in particular is called The Ballet Class, and it shows the sort of unglamorous behind-the-scenes of the ballet class, but still very romantic imagery. Something that the book doesn't mention, though, but is very important to note, there's some speculation and controversy around whether or not Degas was a pervert. Looking at his work, he often portrayed young girls, specifically ballerinas, and there's been some speculation around his participation in the behind-the-scenes ballet scene, specifically because it was, very unfortunately, a bit of a seedy industry at the time. Men would often watch the ballet to see which girl he took a liking to, and getting a backstage pass to rehearsal was seen as a special privilege to these men. Even more unfortunately, perverse behavior with young ballerinas was so normalized at the time that it's hard to know just how much Degas interacted with the girls. It just happened so much and so often that no one can really say if he partook in that side of the industry, because this is so sad, but even if he did, it was so normal at the time that no one would have noticed. Art historians aren't 100% sure if he was a creep, but there's definitely speculation around it. And that's just something to keep in mind when looking at his work, because the more you look at it, you can start to see a bit of a creepy underlying tone to some of his paintings and sculptures, just in my personal opinion. But moving on to another Impressionist that is less problematic and more just all around wonderful, we've got Mary Cassatt, who was a Philadelphia-born artist who befriended Manet and Degas in Paris. And she exhibited with the Impressionists 4 different times, which was very remarkable for a woman at the time, because women were just still so excluded from being professionals in art. And she kind of specialized in painting modern women in their own home day-to-day situations, such as this piece, Young Mother Sewing, which isn't overly sentimental. It doesn't idealize motherhood. It shows the amount of just labor and having companionship there by your side while you're doing this labor for your child. Still talking about Cassatt, this piece is called The Boating Party, and it also has strong resemblance to Japanese prints in terms of its flatness and also the playing with the patterns on the fabric. Also, there's a bit of very subtle feminist content in this piece. Now, you couldn't really get away with putting things that are very overtly feminist in works, especially as a woman artist. But there is something subtle here. The difference in clothing styles between the woman and the man indicates that she's actually hired him to take her and the child out for a boat ride, which was an unusually assertive and financially independent thing for a woman to do for herself in those days. So that's just kind of a little slide in there, about as much as you can get away with at the time in terms of feminist content. But exciting to me nonetheless. And as a bit of a bonus, I just wanted to throw in that Impressionism was not solely confined to painting. There was also Impressionist sculpture, such as Auguste Rodin, who was a sculptor, obviously, and was contemporary to Impressionists, so he was working at the same time, and used Michelangelo's unfinished pieces as inspiration for his own rough finishes. He worked with the mediums of plaster and clay, but this one in particular is bronze. I think we've all seen this before. This is The Thinker, and it really contemplates the idea of a universal artist/poet as creator, and kind of like romanticizes this idea of like the personal genius of the artist. Now let's move on a bit to the post-impressionist period, which, just like the stylistic pluralism I was talking about earlier, really did not share a single monolithic style, but were all just different reactions to Impressionism. But they did all have a sort of formal organization to them, such as Seurat's A Sunday on Le Grand Jeté, which is not an image of a fleeting moment, which is kind of what Impressionism is trying to capture, although it does have Impressionist qualities. But this piece is the first piece that we see that utilizes divisionism, also known as pointillism, which is what you've probably heard of before. So this is the first real pointillist piece. That means that it's made up of a bunch of tiny dots of color, and if you look up close, you just see a bunch of tiny dots, but then you stand farther away and all the dots merge together, and they create this optical color mixture achieved by dots of colors and mixed with the eyes. Basically, the farther back you go, it blurs together and you're able to see the whole image. So this piece is huge. And fun fact, or actually kind of sad fact, it was initially displayed in a room far too small for it, so viewers could only look at it from up close. And because of that, it was initially very much hated on, the reviews were terrible. But then later people realized that if you display it in a bigger room and stand farther away, you can see this whole composition that you're not able to from up close. So the artist kind of got shafted there a bit in terms of the world's initial thoughts on it. But now it's very highly regarded in art history. Still thinking about formal organization, but in a different way. This is Paul Cezanne, who intended to make Impressionism be a solid and enduring genre of art, just like museum art. and was working with Impressionist ideas, but did kind of push it. Sorry, that was my dog, if you heard that. But did kind of push it further than just the Impressionist brush strokes. Here we've got a little bit of almost geometric brush strokes organized in that way. And these planar surfaces of subjects are seen in terms of color modulation here, so changing the color in order to change the plane that we interpret the image to be on. This particular piece is called Mont Saint-Victor, and it has the impression of air and depth through the use of color. There's almost geometric planes and masses, as I said, and there's also a lot of rhythm in this because of how many different parallel brush strokes are all on the composition, all facing the same direction, and in that way kind of playing off of each other and creating that sense of rhythm. Next, we've got the Expressionist style, not to be confused with the Impressionist style, but the Expressionist style focused on emotional intensity through strong color contrasts, bold brushwork, and contours. And probably the artist most known for this Expressionist style, also considered an Impressionist a bit, but diverging a little bit from the norm of Impressionism, is Vincent van Gogh, who is known for his highly textural brushwork. He uses very strong color to express emotions clearly. And as you can see here, especially, there is influence of Japanese prints, heavily influenced by Japanese prints, just as a lot of artists were at the time. So you can see these flat color areas and simplified shapes, such as in this piece in particular, Japaneserie flowering plum tree. Fun fact, he actually saw this print at a local print shop, and he would go there to study the prints and just look at all of them, and he saw a Japanese print for the first time and was just blown away because it was so different than anything he had seen before. So he actually copied the print as a study, and this is what that is. But moving on to more of his less studies and more like original works. This is The Sower, and Vincent van Gogh is, I'm sure you all know, very much known for his personal expression. He had a very emotionally challenging life, and he expressed a lot of emotion in his works. So this piece, The Sower, has these bold, simplified shapes, just like we see in Japanese woodcut prints, and the flat areas of color. But also there's a sort of balance struck here between the strength and darkness of the tree trunk and the bold, glimmering sun in the background. And last but not least, for Vincent van Gogh, let's talk a little bit about his most famous piece. I'm sure you've all seen it before, which is The Starry Night. Now, The Starry Night was actually painted from the view from his window in the St. Paul de Massuel mental asylum, which he willingly checked himself into to seek help for his mental illness. So it's a wonderfully beautiful work and so famous, and he actually created it during a, I'm sure, very, very challenging time in his life, just looking out the window. He wasn't held there against his will, but as a responsible person, he checked himself in. And this piece shows tremendous cosmic forces in the sky, and the church's spire also kind of echoes the cypress trees in the foreground, and also shows the very small scale of human life in contrast with the landscape and the stars. Kind of fun fact, there's now some speculation around Van Gogh's death, which has been considered a suicide for many years. There's some promising evidence that he may have been shot by local children and actually hid that evidence in order to protect them from being punished. We don't know for sure, but it's possible. And I guess I wanted to include that because it seems very nice just to think that he passed away actually as an act of kindness, trying to not get children in trouble instead of the grim alternative that we all think that he did. But yeah, that's just a little fact about Van Gogh. Also, Van Gogh is not how you're supposed to pronounce it. It's Van Gogh. But no one actually says that, or At least in America, no one says that. So if you say Van Gogh, people are going to know what you're talking about, and you're just fine. Moving on from one lovely person to one terrible human being. Oh my God, this guy is so bad. We have Paul Gauguin. I'm blown away. He's literally a terrible human being, but the book didn't want me to tell you that. Like, the book only said good things about Gauguin and didn't say any of just the horrible stuff. So I'm determined to give you guys the full picture of this artist. I'm genuinely very upset about how the book paints this man in a positive light. The book says that he desired to rejuvenate European art with insights from non-Western tradition. And in a way, that's kind of true, but that's totally romanticizing it. He did leave his family and his life behind to move to Tahiti at age 43 for what the book says was an attempt to break with civilization. But in reality, it was just a fetishization of what he believed was an undeveloped or primitive culture. And he was literally a pedophile with a 13-year-old Tahitian child bride that he bought, and her name was Teha Amana, and her marriage was arranged against her will, and she bore his child. So, not a good guy. Not a good guy at all. And I know that we can separate the art from the artist. He did paint pretty colors, I guess. I mean, he's got a masterful use of color here, but I just... I find it completely appalling that the book decided to leave all of that information out, and I just wanted to be real with you guys and tell you the actual story of Gauguin. Anyway, moving on from that train wreck of a human being, we have Henri de ToulouseLautrec, who is, he's fine. I don't know if there's anything problematic about him, but from what we can tell, he's fine. And this piece is at the Moulin Rouge, and we've also looked at ToulouseLautrec artwork before, specifically in prints, because in the printmaking lecture, we talked a lot about how influential his prints were, but he also did oil paintings, which is what we're seeing here. So this piece at the Moulin Rouge uses unusual angles and cropping and has very expressive, unnatural color that heightens our feelings and perceptions about the people in the world that he painted. So it's just a kind of exciting push away from normal compositions and getting into something just more different and more creative and less tied to reality or tethered to what everything has to actually look like. We're moving towards just completely unnatural colors and strange shapes. Now, moving on to symbolism, which symbolism has been around forever. I mean, it's a device, like a literary device, but it can be in any form of art. But the idea of putting symbolism in your art was really started to develop a lot around 1885, and further with Edvard Munch. So there were decorative forms and symbols that were intentionally vague or open-ended so that different people could take from it different things, and everyone kind of brings their own perception to the artwork. And probably the best known for this is Edvard Munch, who carried symbolism to expressive intensity, especially in his most famous piece, The Scream, in which the dominant figure is caught in isolation, fear, and loneliness. A sort of soul cry is what this horrified expression has been portrayed as, or described as. And moving on from that, we have Art Nouveau. Now, I'm sure you remember from the printmaking lecture, but ToulouseLautrec really did push Art Nouveau through his printmaking and that very specific style, but it actually started as a bit of a architectural style. So since we've already looked at all of those Art Nouveau prints from ToulouseLautrec, let's look a bit at the architecture, which is what it was all inspired from anyway. Now, Art Nouveau literally means new art, and it was considered the new art of architecture and interior design. and it brought the idea of nature into art in new ways. So there was lots of, depictions of flowers or vines or organic shapes like that. Here we have Hector Guimard's Castle Beranger. This is a lobby within the castle, and this castle is the first Parisian Art Nouveau house. It had a designed exterior, wallpaper, door handles, carpets, light fixtures, the whole 9 yards. Everything was put together to create this overall aesthetic effect. And the lobby is what we're looking at now. It strongly exploits the motif of organic growth. So you can see all of these curving organic shapes, somewhat like vines coming up all around. And also these abstracted plant forms. And the scheme here really makes no reference to past styles. Art Nouveau is, like it says in the name, very new in terms of having seen anything like it before. Now, another piece of Art Nouveau architecture to know is the Casa Mila, which is by Antoni Gaudí. Locals call it La Pedrera, or the quarry. And you can see this does kind of look like an underwater coral reef type of situation. The Art Nouveau ideas are in the framework of this building with these wildly curving blocks, so much more organic of a way to shape architecture than we've seen before. And even the window openings themselves are organically shaped. Now, moving on to chapter 22, we're just continuing the narrative and moving to the early 20th century. Now, as a sort of introduction to where we're at in history at this point, there's changing views of the nature of reality itself. We've got all these new ideas coming out. We've got Sigmund Freud making, honestly, horrible discoveries. If you guys want me to talk about how much I hate Sigmund Freud in class, let me know, because I would like to dig that man up just to bury him again. But that's beside the point. We also have the Wright brothers. We've got people are flying through the air. We've got Madame Curie. We've got radiation and new chemistry discoveries. We've got Einstein and this whole idea of like the space-time continuum and all of this science happening. And at the same time, we have the impact of the Industrial Revolution. So the middle class is starting to have a longer life expectancy. There's revolutions in different places all around the world because of class tension. And artists are also inspired by scientific discoveries. So some of the characteristics of 20th century art are rapid change, diversity, individualism, and exploration. And a lot of these come to a head with the movement of Fauvism, which overturned the authority of Renaissance with new forms of expression. And here's an example of a Fauvist work. This is Harmony in Red by Matisse. Now, Matisse is probably the most well-known Fauvist, but let's just look at what Fauvism is. And its name comes from les fauves, which means wild beasts. So you can see we're really pushing past this very strict academic style of painting and just going literally wild. So here looking at Matisse again, he's known for his expressive, thoughtful paintings and would reduce subjects to a few outlines to preserve the original impulse of feeling. So instead of working so hard to painstakingly shade all of these different muscles to make a perfect figure, it has this very improvised and quick and therefore energetic quality. It really preserves the energy of the work in order to not heavily render everything to be super realistic. It just gives everything that energy that I'm talking about. So this piece is called The Joy of Life, and it's got this very intentionally direct, childlike quality of form. Things are so much less realistic than anyone's used to, and the colors are even more childlike. And this seemingly careless depiction of figures keeps the composition very loose and energetic. Next, we've got André Derain, who made this painting London Bridge, another Fauvist. And this has brilliant invented color, so it's not the actual colors of the scene, but colors made up in the artist's mind's eye. And this is balanced by the traditional composition and perspective. So we've got a little bit of traditional things in terms of how the painting is laid out, but the colors are very inventive and different. And also there are expanded versions of pointillist dots, like Cassatt did in his Sunday at Le Grand Jeté. You can see in the lower left, they're not exactly dots. It's more like the Impressionists were working with in terms of having like a bunch of different brush strokes that create this optical blend when you move away. But it is sort of referencing it there in the lower left, especially. And in the water, just in general, the reflections on the water. Fauvism actually only lasted for 2 years. It was from 1905 to 1907, but it was one of the most influential developments in the early 20th century, and the work led to an increasing use of color as an independent expressive element, which is something that we'll see continue after Fauvism. So we've got continuations of Expressionism here in the 20th century. And this is referencing Expressionism, that is the general term for art that emphasizes inner feelings over objective depiction. It can be traced to Baroque's Delacroix, which we looked at earlier. But here is an example of German Expressionism, which really focuses on themes of natural life, sorrow, passion, spirituality, mysticism, and the human condition. So there were different groups or schools of thought within these continuations of Expressionism, and one of the groups was called the Blue Reiter group, or Du Blaue Reiter group. It was led by Wassily Kandinsky, and he encouraged everyone in the group to make art to turn people away from false values. And here is an example of an artwork from this sort of style that the group was following. It's called Blue Mountain, and it's also by Kandinsky, and it has this like choir of colors. So we're really moving towards the colorful here. We have a shift to non-representational imagery by 1910, which broke the sort of rule that art should be a picture of some subject. And instead it is depicting nothing at all. It's just from the artist's mind's eye completely. And this art is also in response to the sort of inner necessity and spirituality that people see in the reasons that we make art. This piece is composition 4. Moving to German Expressionism, we see a lot of vivid, often angular simplifications of subjects. We have dramatic color contrasts. These ideas were built on Gauguin, Van Gogh, and Munch, and these subject matters generally compel us to assess or address the human condition. So still working with ideas of natural life, sorrow, passion, spirituality, and mysticism. And it's also influenced by medieval German art and art from Africa and Oceania. So we're looking at a different group of expressionists now, the Bridge group, or Die Brücke group. And this group was primarily led by Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, who expressed raw emotion similar to Munch and incorporated ideas from Cubism and African sculpture, and also some German Gothic qualities into the style. This piece in particular is called Street Berlin, and it has these very dissonant colors and crude brushwork that also is characteristic of the style used frequently by the Bridge group. Another member of the Bridge group is Modersohn Becker, who created this self-portrait with an amber necklace. And this piece reduced the curves of the head to flat regions. So we're continuing to stylize the face. She's got oversized eyes and these really flattened out planes of the face, and just working in a more illustrative and stylized way. So that is a self-portrait with an amber necklace. And then moving on to Cubism. Now, Cubism changed art forever. And I have my qualms with Pablo Picasso, but he was so influential. So Cubism is mainly led by Pablo Picasso and his friend, the French artist Georges Braque. Pablo Picasso is Spanish, Braque is French. And they together pursued investigations that led to Cubism. Generally, Picasso is given the credit for, inventing Cubism, but if you actually look at the timeline, Braque was making Cubist works before Picasso. So, honestly, we should be crediting all of this to Braque, but that's just kind of how the cookie crumbles, unfortunately. But what is Cubism? It's pictorial composition over personal expression. And this style heavily influenced basic visual structure of many notable paintings and sculptures that came after it. And it's also become a part of our daily lives because it's had so much of a direct influence on architecture and the arts. So basically, Cubism is taking things and looking at them from multiple perspectives at once. I'll get into that a bit more, but let's first talk about this painting that we're looking at here, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which is the breakthrough painting that is considered to be the first Cubist painting by Pablo Picasso, despite the fact that Braque made work that seems very Cubist in a few years previous to this. It's still considered the first one. It has a radical departure from traditional composition using multiple perspectives and fractured angular forms. So what I mean by multiple perspectives is the faces are a good way to see this. The eyes, it's like you're looking at them from straight on, but the noses, it's like you're looking from the side. And this is all throughout. You'll see things that just don't line up. Like if you were to take a picture, you would need to take multiple pictures and Photoshop them together because it's just not the way that things look when you think of a stagnant image. But if you think of the way that our brain understands images and the fact that we're always kind of moving around and looking at things from different perspectives, it is a little bit more realistic to the way our brain perceives images. Rather than the way that an image would look if you just took a photograph with a camera and printed it out. This piece is also rife with art history references, such as the sideways 1 foot forward Egyptian pose, the still life in the front, the Ivory Coast style African mask on this woman who has her head turned all the way around, and also another woman in the back, also on the right side. Also, the figures emerging from curtains, the Venus-like poses, the list goes on. There's a lot of art history here. And there's also the first real depiction of the femme fatale, or the dangerous woman. This is a depiction of women at a brothel, and they're meant to be so confrontational that, in fact, one of them literally has her head turned around backwards like an owl to be making confrontational eye contact with you. And it's kind of portraying these women as they're in these somewhat powerful stances, but they're also villainized in the sense that Picasso definitely saw brothels and women that worked in the streets, sex workers, as these very evil deliverers of venereal disease, as if men don't also transmit those diseases. But it's got a lot of, let's just say that there's a lot of feminist commentary to be made about honestly anything that Picasso makes, but this one in particular. But Braque's additions to Cubist vocabulary, they're not really additions because he really worked with these ideas a lot earlier than Picasso did. But the way that it's written in art history, it's that he was adding to Picasso's idea, even though that's not correct. But the shapes define forms that pile up in shallow, ambiguous space. And he explored the formal structure without emotional distractions of color and showed objects from the mind's perspective. So still working with this idea of multiple perspectives, or at least not working with mathematically accurate perspective. Now, there are two different classes of cubism. We've got analytical cubism, which analyzed subjects from various angles, then painted abstract geometric references to views from multiple angles. So this example is The Portuguese by Braque, and it is a portrait of a man at a cafe table strumming a guitar, but it's so abstracted that you really probably wouldn't be able to tell that if I didn't give you a clue. And then on the other hand, besides analytical cubism, we have synthetic cubism, which is a modified version of analytical cubism using color, texture, and pattern surfaces and shapes taken from cutouts. So we see the invention of collage here in synthetic cubism. So printed images pasted onto paper, cut out, and added together. That's what we think of when we think collage, and this is really where it came from. Here is an example from Picasso. This is violin, fruit, and wine glass. And just to show that this doesn't all have to be in the two-dimensional plane, but can also be sculptural, we have Picasso's guitar, which is assembled from sheet metal. So it is still assembling things together, sort of like the way that one would assemble different images and paste them together for a two-dimensional collage. But this work began a very dominant trend toward sculptural construction. Before guitar, most sculpture was carved or modeled. And since guitar, a great deal of sculpture has been constructed of different pieces put together by the artist. Now we're starting to move towards abstract sculpture. And a great example of this is the move towards abstraction in Constantin Brancusi. So Brancusi was a Romanian who studied under Rodin, and he had a radical yet gradual break with the past. So you can see that here in these three images. We've got Sleep in 1908 compared to Rodin's Romantic Naturalism, which is who he studied under. And then in the middle, we have Sleeping Muse 1 in 1911, which starts to simplify the subject, but is not completely simplified. And then on the far right, we've got Newborn 1 in 1915, which is just completely stripped to essentials. It's just, there's not really even a recognizable face, but it suggests the head of something, or someone, I should say. So we're moving towards early modern art. So let's talk a bit about what made early modern art in the United States. And most of this is because of the Armory Show, which was a sort of gallery show that took European art to New York and gave the American public the first look at all of these developments that have been made in European art. So people were able to actually go see the art in person for the first time, really. And this opened in New York in 1913 and is still going to this day, although it's not only European art anymore. It's like art from all over the world, but primarily America. But anyway, at the time, it was a show of European art in New York. And organizers tried to demonstrate that modern art was not revolutionary, but that it had been happening in Europe. And so this really pushed us forward into modernism in the United States. And the American public was actually shocked at seeing Cubism and Expressionism for the first time. And after seeing this, all of these Cubist and other abstract forms spread to the United States. And that's how we get our sort of modern art United States scene. So here is a photograph that is of this time period of early modern art in America. And this is by Alfred Stieglitz. And this is called The Steerage, which is a somewhat abstract composition. I mean, if you break it down into lines and shapes, it has a composition to it. However, it is definitely portraying something because it is a photo of people on a boat. But it did look to some people like two photographs pasted together rather than just one. And part of that is why people think it's like a little bit abstracted. And the shapes and underlying feelings give this very like stressed, busy, but also dynamic vibe to it, especially with the very bold diagonal line right in the middle. And this artist, Stieglitz, created an influential gallery that included photography in New York and began to show work by American modernists. And looking forward, we have Georgia O'Keeffe. Well, not forward because it's at the same time, but Georgia O'Keeffe was actually Alfred Stieglitz's wife for a period of time. So I guess I'm telling you guys a little bit of a love story. But just to give a background on Georgia O'Keeffe, her work consists of abstractions based on nature, often using flowers as ionic symbolism. So that very vulva-like quality of flower petals, not in this piece per se, but in a lot of her other works, she'll use that as symbolism. This piece is called Evening Star, and it's based on sightings of the planet Venus in the darkening sky in the Texas Panhandle. And the planet of Venus itself is left unpainted. It's made of negative space, but the paint around it shows that it's meant to be there. And there's these very wide radiating sweeps of highly saturated color here, and that is pretty normal for Georgia O'Keeffe's work. Now, about the relationship between O'Keeffe and Stieglitz, they had a nearly lifelong relationship. They started with admiring each other to eventually marrying each other and heavily influencing each other's works, then eventually separating from each other, but finding themselves to respect one another and be on amicable terms, although they weren't married anymore. But their relationship very much influenced each other and therefore influenced the movement of American modern art in general. The time they spent together in New York highly influenced O'Keeffe's work, such as this piece by her on the left, Radiator Building Night, New York. And it's too small for us to be able to really see, but there in the sort of red glow towards the left side, Stieglitz's name is in neon, so she actually included her husband or ex-husband at the time's name. And then after their separation, Stieglitz really focused on images of the sky, which you can see in this photograph equivalence. Now, we're moving a bit more forward and not just sticking to America. Let's look at Italian futurists. This group added a sense of speed and motion to shifting planes and multiple vantage points, just like the multiple vantage points in Cubism, but instead really focusing on this idea of motion. And also the futurists really celebrated machines, specifically machines that allowed us to move faster, like cars and planes. So this piece, Abstract Speed, The Car Has Passed, is a great example of that. There's this rushing air and dynamic feeling of a roaring motor car passing by. And the fastest racing cars in 1913 actually reached speeds of 100 miles per hour. So that was faster than trains and airplanes at the time. And that just kind of gives an idea of that like very fast motion that we're somehow having captured in a still image, which is kind of hard to do, to capture the essence of motion in an image that is unmoving. But I think Bala does a good job of that here. Now, we've still got this idea of capturing the essence of motion in something that is still, but moving it into sculpture. We have Umberto Boccioni, who made sculpture, but also fused with surrounding space. The separation between the two legs, it's really the air that moves between and around this piece is just as much a part of the piece as the artwork itself. And also these very muscular forms, but that are completely abstracted, leap forth in these bursts of energy, and you really just get this idea of this figure moving, although you look at it and it never moves because it is a still sculpture. Another artist who worked with this idea of capturing movement, and specifically like this futurist idea, but he was working independently from the futurists, is Marcel Duchamp. This piece is Nude Descending a Staircase number 2, and it's influenced by stroboscopic photography, which is like when you have multiple photos kind of overlapped over each other and you can see different moments of someone's movement. Like like if you were to take multiple photos of a ballerina doing a dance move and then overlap them over each other so you can kind of like see the dance move, although it's all just one still image. That's what stroboscopic photography is. But it's the movement of a body all seen at once. And it was initially described as an explosion in a shingle factory, which I just think is kind of a quirky little description of this piece here that I wanted to share. And then last but not least for this lecture, let's look at Sonia Delaunay-Turc's Le Bal Bullier, which is an interpretation of couples moving on the floor of a nightclub. So you can see all these sort of abstracted human forms, often like embracing each other as if dancing together. And this push and pull of colors really brings depth. So the warm colors come to the front, cool colors recede, as I'm sure you guys probably remember from our little color theory lesson. But this really pushed that effect of portraying movement despite it being a still image. And this artist, Delaunay-Turc, was an early crusader for integration of art into everyday things, such as bookbindings, embroideries, textiles, and fashions. And with that, we only have one lecture left, and it is all the most exciting stuff in my personal opinion. So I look forward to seeing you all in class, and I look forward to our last lecture. Have a good one.